Welcome to More Than a Therapy Couch, the podcast where we go beyond the walls of traditional therapy sessions. I'm your host, Tiana. In a world that's constantly changing, so are the ways we navigate our mental and emotional health. We're here to embrace the notion that healing and growth extend far beyond the walls of a therapy room. Throughout this podcast, we'll be joined by a diverse array of experts and everyday individuals with compelling stories to help bring awareness to whatever you may be facing. We'll unpack the complexities of the human experience, tackle taboo topics, and challenge the stigmas surrounding mental health. So grab your emotional support water bottle, find a comfy spot, and join us as we embark on a journey that goes more than a therapy couch. Let the session begin. As a reminder, the topics discussed are for educational purposes only and are not meant to be taken as clinical advice. If you are concerned about you or a loved one's mental health, consult a mental health professional or call SAMHSA's 24-hour hotline at 1-800-662-HELP. Welcome back to More Than a Therapy Couch. I'm your host, Tiana, and we're back again with an experienced therapist from Tree of Life Counseling Center. Today we have Abigail, and she is here to talk about the importance of mental health during the holidays. Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing good. So Abby, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, your credentials, and how you kind of became to be a therapist?
Sure. So my name's Abby. I'm a licensed associate counselor. I also am almost finished with getting my license in addictions counseling, so 3 more classes.
Very exciting.
Let's see. So I have been at Tree of Life for under about 2 years. I previously came from an addictions counseling center, so my primary background is in addiction. It's where I started my internship, where I worked for a bit, and then I came here. So primarily here I see families, couples, individuals, age ranges, probably around like 13 and up, with a multitude of various different things that they come for, such as anxiety, depression, life stressors, things like that.
And when you are seeing your clients, do you see that there's like a correlation between mental health and addiction?
For sure. I do think that they go hand in hand. I do find like when I am treating like substance use clients, they do have like a mental health diagnosis. It's usually co-occurring. A lot of times we utilize substances to cope with like stressors. So whether that be like mental health stressors or not, we use that as like a way to either avoid or to cope with those things. So I do see them hand in hand quite often.
And in terms of you becoming a therapist, was there something in particular that kind of led to being a counselor? How was that like for you?
So I feel like a lot of people will give the same exact answer, but it started with people always saying like, "Oh, you're such a good listener. Oh, thank you for listening. Thanks for giving me that feedback." That we're not supposed to give advice in counseling, but advice. So anyway, fast forward in high school, I took a psychology class and I really loved it. So I ended up getting my undergrad in psych. I did not want to go for 10 years of schooling. So instead, I settled on the mental health track. So I got my master's in mental health counseling and wellness.
Very nice. And so we have you on this episode today to kind of talk about addiction, talking about families during the holidays. And I'm sure, you've seen, for even some of your clients, that the holidays can be really hard for a multitude of reasons. However, on this episode, we want to kind of explore what it's like staying sober during the holidays, how to kind of deal with maybe toxic family members, and how to navigate through those struggles during this time. One of the main things we kind of wanted to really focus on is creating a support system, or informing people on creating a support system and coping strategies that they can kind of do during this time if they do feel like they are struggling, or learning about the coping strategies where if you do have someone in your life as a family member that is struggling with this, you can kind of be like, listen, this is something we kind of need to talk about. This is why, this is how you'll benefit, and kind of just like educating everyone, whether it's yourself, whether it's your family, and just kind of talking about what that's like. So in terms of what you've seen with your clients, what have you seen have been some common themes during the holidays?
It's actually kind of funny because when I used to do like groups in my previous place, addiction focused, we would actually hold specific groups on like how to cope with stressors during the holidays, because there's been so many times where clients come in, they're like, I'm worried to like go to this party. I'm worried to spend time with my family, you know, et cetera. So it's actually a very common thing that we actually like focus on. We're like, we need to talk about this. But the holidays do come with like an influx of stressors, right? Whether that be, you know, seasonal feelings because it's getting darker, it's colder, whether it's, you know, family dysfunction, financial stressors, trying to get that perfect gift for your family member. There's a lot of emotional dysregulation that happens during the holidays.
I can definitely attest to that. I feel like with me, sometimes I try to be a little bit too much of a perfectionist with certain things, so I can understand where like you get so excited to maybe like give someone, you know, that gift, or you planned it all out. And especially if you're hosting for the holidays, you may feel that pressure. Everything needs to be perfect, or everything needs to go a certain way. And unfortunately, that's not how life is. Things don't necessarily work out that way. So I can definitely see how it can be really hard during the holidays. Today's episode is brought to you by Tree of Life Counseling Center, where people come to heal, deal, and learn to thrive. They currently have immediate availability for talk therapy and medication management with a team of over 50 licensed clinicians. Are you feeling alone? We all can use someone to talk to. Call 732-393-8391 or visit us at www.treeoflifecc.org to start your journey of self-discovery and healing today. I know you mentioned that some of the reasons why people struggle with anxiety during this time, or struggle with, you know, mental health and addiction during this time, is just because of kind of triggers and stressors. What are, or why are the holidays like particularly such a hard time for those struggling with addiction? Now, I know you mentioned maybe there's parties and things along those lines, but are there any other things that make this time so hard that it may be unbearable for some people?
I mean, if we just talk about like New Year's, right? Like it is centered around alcohol, or partying rather. So whatever substances come with that, but alcohol, right? Like we cheers at the end, or, you know, we say goodbye to the last year and welcome the new year with like a celebration. So alcohol is everywhere. If we were just to talk about that substance, at family parties, like eggnog and things like that have alcohol in them. So it's very hard to avoid. I don't want to say it's impossible to avoid, but it is very difficult to avoid.
Alcohol and substances, are certain substances where like people would be like, yeah, no, like I wouldn't touch that. I wouldn't do that. And I think people don't necessarily realize, just because drinking can be so social and can be so like socially acceptable, that like recognizing that you may have an issue with this or you may be addicted to this is something that I think is a little bit harder, especially during that time, because it's socially acceptable. Everyone's doing it. What's the big deal? Everyone's drinking. Everyone's doing that. So how does someone kind of like navigate that, where specifically with alcohol, that's something that's socially acceptable, but how much is too much?
Well, I guess that would depend on person to person rather, and like the actions and behaviors that follow. You know, if it's something that's interrupting someone's life and causing, you know, family issues, like we can look at that and be like, oh, that's problematic. You know, I could pull up the numbers, but I can't tell you right now off the top of my head. But, you know, there's like a certain amount of drinks that like they recommend like a week, whether that's male or female. And if we're going like substantially above that, like, okay, that's something to consider. But yeah, it's so socially acceptable. I mean, it's been legal forever, right? And people see it in a very positive light when it comes to like partying or social gatherings. So because holidays are so social, it tends to come with that.
Yeah. And people don't realize certain things that come with it too. Like you may feel really anxious or really depressed because you are drinking a lot, or are you recognizing is there a specific reason as to why you're resorting to that? Are you getting home from work and you're like, I'm so drained with the day, I'm going to just have this. And then it slowly happens. I don't think anyone ever wakes up one day and they're like, I'm going to be addicted to this. It happens, you know, over time. So with individuals who are navigating sobriety, while they're navigating this during the holidays, and, you know, you mentioned we have New Year's, we have all of these gatherings, what are certain things that they can kind of do for themselves if they know that they're going to be around those triggers?
Sure. So, I mean, again, everyone's like sobriety or recovery looks completely different. Like what works for this person might not work for this person, vice versa. So, you know, in addition, like everyone's recovery time is different too. Like being in recovery for a week might look very different than being in recovery for a year, right? So it really is dependent on the person. I always say like utilize the skills that you've learned that work for you, and it doesn't hurt to add more. So I guess some things like blanketed statement wise that we could try is a lot of times I would tell my groups like create like an exit strategy. So whether that's like you drive yourself or you have like a ride that you know is like sober that can like take you. We say like surround yourself with like sober people. So if you know someone at the party or a family member is sober, like isn't going to drink, like maybe align with them. So creating an escape plan. Other things like, and again, this is not for everyone in recovery because there's a lot of people that will tell you they do not like recovery meetings. So like people will be like, I don't like AA or whatever. Again, like it's used as like a supplemental support. So if you need someone that aligns with sobriety, like AA, NA, Narcotics Anonymous. There's other groups too, like if you're not interested in those, like Smart Recovery, which is based a lot more on like cognitive behavioral therapy. And then there's like Refuge Recovery, which is more like meditation based. Again, there's websites that like I provided so we could attach those, but like you could always look into them. But there's different types of meetings. It doesn't have to be AA or NA if you're not into that. Another option is you could like look for an opportunity to be busy. So maybe you want to help out the people in the kitchen, right? You're away from the partying, so to speak. Some triggers are optional. So for example, if like Aunt Mary is going to talk about your time in rehab and that's going to trigger you, maybe we don't talk to Aunt Mary or we limit our time talking to Aunt Mary, you know? And then I guess the last thing would be build your toolbox of coping strategies. Like you can never have too many coping strategies because sometimes your go-to coping strategy might not work for that situation.
And one thing that I absolutely loved that you mentioned is that what works for one person will not work for someone else. Another thing to think about too is, like you said, if you've been sober for a week compared to if you've been sober to a year, it depends on what you are addicted to also.
That's fair.
So you know, they always say the people you surround yourself with are the people that you are or who you are. So, like, who are you surrounding yourselves with? If you realize that you are going to become sober or you want to make the step to become sober, are you going to still hang out with the people who are always doing this or always doing that? You may be able to, depending on, you know, your relationship with them. If your friend, I think, values your boundaries, they will respect that. But there are multiple times, too, where you have that one friend that's like, come on, just do it. Come on, it's all right. Just have one drink. It'll be fine. And you need to know yourself, and you need to know what works for you. And again, like you said, if you try something and it doesn't work for you, don't put yourself in that position, too. I
mean, the biggest thing that they say in recovery is like people, places, and things, right? Like avoid those triggers. I'm not going to go into the science behind your brain, really, but like basically our brain is primed to reinforce things to get to a desired outcome, things that make us feel good. So if I know that when I look at, I don't know, a person that I used to use with, that's going to prime my brain to be like, okay, like this is your person. Now you guys are going to go do this thing that's going to make you feel good. So ideally, especially early on in recovery, like avoiding people, places, and things.
You mentioned that it usually goes hand in hand with mental health. So with the people who are coming to counseling for addiction, what are some common mental health struggles that you have seen that they've also kind of struggled with, whether that's just in general or specifically during the holidays, and how are those specifically linked to family?
Okay.
So two-part question.
I mean, I would just go with a generalized statement because, again, everyone's different and everyone uses for various different reasons. But, like, depression and anxiety are the big two that I see because it does cause a lot of, like, emotional distress. And how do we cope with emotional distress? Well, I want to go to the quickest thing that works, a substance. So I see that a lot, or, like, you know, trauma. But in regards to family, a lot of dynamics within the family, usually more so like dysfunctional family dynamics, can create a lot of tension, like within the family and then within the individual, tension leading to anxiety or depression or extreme frustration. Like I'm going to want to feel okay. So I'm going to find the first thing that makes me feel okay.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that I definitely want to point out with what you said, like when you are struggling with addiction, they're looking for the first thing that will make them feel okay. Mm-hmm. But that's also not something that like, okay, I did this, now I'm cured, I'm great, I'm perfect. It's like, no, that helped you for 20 minutes, an hour. Like, how much did that really help you for? And that's something to kind of think about too, is like, you can keep doing that, but that's just the same as like putting a Band-Aid on like a cut that needs stitches. Like it's gonna keep opening up, and see why you kind of do it, even to begin with.
I mean, the problem's still gonna be there. The emotions aren't going anywhere unless we tackle them head on and deal with them, or cope with them rather.
You know, we mentioned the triggers, we mentioned we mentioned the common mental health conditions that kind of go hand in hand with sobriety. Now, in terms of family, if they are in a dysfunctional family or a part of like a toxic family, how does someone who's trying to be sober, how can their family members that are toxic or manipulating affect their mental health and affect their sobriety?
Yeah, and I guess like there is no like blanketed statement here. Like that can look different for anyone. It can create a lot of different thoughts, feelings, whatnot. But I would go to, it's going to create a lot of emotional distress, right? Like if we're not feeling like heard, validated, loved, cared for from a family member, like how do you think we're going to feel? Probably not so great. If we're setting boundaries and this family member keeps like going through those boundaries, like pushing past them, we're going to feel not respected, or we're going to feel like what we are saying like doesn't matter, that we don't have that like space to like protect ourselves. It could lower like our self-esteem. It could create self-destructive behaviors. It could do a multitude of things, depending on like what's happening within the family or what the person's doing.
So with sobriety and with family, obviously it can be a very hard topic to kind of talk to your family about, especially first admitting that, one, you have a problem. That's a huge step, or you think you may have a problem. And then two, once you kind of acknowledge like, okay, I'm in that addiction and you want to work on that, it can, affect a bunch of different things. But with specifically family, are there certain behaviors that family members might do to kind of challenge a person's sobriety?
I would say I'm sure there's a lack of trust there. And again, don't want to make assumptions, but if someone has been behaving in a certain way and lying for so long, or doing behaviors for so long that we're just used to those patterns, the family might question them. And that in itself could like trigger the individual, because it's like, well, I went through all this work to get better. Why are you questioning me? And we can kind of see it twofold, in the sense that like the individual is like, why isn't my family trusting me? Look at all this work I did. But the family is also in a position where they're like, there isn't trust there. Like you've broken it so many times. So I think a big component of that is like rebuilding trust with the family.
What would be a good step to kind of start rebuilding that trust, whether you are the individual that has now put in all this work and has been through a detox and is now sober, and now you're presenting that with your family, and it can be discouraging. And obviously you can't just be like, well, just believe me. I want you to believe me. It's kind of like, well, all right, well, what can I do to kind of build that trust? But the same thing too, like from the family's point of view, like kind of gauging that, like if that person in your family does seem like they're really putting in the work, be that support system and support them. And it can be a little discouraging if they did have a relapse, but I'm curious to see what it is on both sides, from the client side and then from the like the family side.
I think a lot of it comes with effective communication from both ends, right? Like communicating what our expectations are, what our needs are, what our wants are, et cetera. Coming from like a clinical standpoint, a big part is like education. So a lot of times families don't understand addiction or like the components of it. So sometimes it takes like either an outside party to be like, hey, like this is what your loved one is going through, or it's like you you could do the research on your own too, or you could even sit there and ask your loved one, like, what was this like? Like, what are you going through? What's treatment like? What type of skills are you using? Things like that. I think it all comes from like communication and education.
And I love that you said that, because I feel like that's such a big thing in terms of the ignorance surrounding addiction. There's certain people where they're just like, I don't have an addiction. Why? I don't understand why you do. Just stop. So being honest, again, what you said, like understanding that and understanding that like there's different aspects to everything. And if you're open and honest, and that's all you can hope for. I think that's what adds more distrust and more, you know, why are you even doing this from like the family's point of view, is because it's like, you said this, but you're doing something else.
I mean, by definition, a substance use disorder is a progressive brain disease. So just like how we have physical ailments, it does impact the brain. It physically changes structures in our brain. So no, we can't just stop if we want to. And everyone's different. Some people can put it down. Some people can't.
Yeah. It really just depends on the person, and it depends on their DNA. It depends on, I feel like, how you were raised too. So with, you know, counseling, with, you know, mental health and addiction, where does someone kind of go from here? If they feel like they don't have a support system with their family, let's say they don't have, you know, a great support system in terms of they don't want to go to AA or NA, what are other kind of support systems or support networks that they can research, can kind of join, be a part of, so that they don't slip up or that they don't get out of sobriety?
Well, I do encourage some type of supplemental support. So if it's not AA or NA, like, again, there's other meetings that I mentioned earlier. And again, like, if it's not for everyone, that's fine. But it is a good place to find people that either understand or are supportive of like the progress or the process rather. So I would encourage at least trying one. I've had clients that said, like, I went to this AA meeting and I hated it, but then I went to this AA meeting down the road and I loved it, because every meeting is run differently. And there's different types of meetings. There's like speaker meetings, or there's like share, I guess, someone that like everyone can kind of like share kind of thing. So like there's different types of meetings rather. Maybe you have a trusted friend that isn't someone that you used with or drank with. Maybe this person is sober. Like you can utilize your friends. You can utilize them as a support, maybe extended family.
A lot of different things. And I feel like, especially during the holidays, like if you are feeling alone, you are feeling isolated, making sure that you are getting in connect with these support networks, because the holidays, what does that bring around? You said stress, there's some triggers, and just being around family sometimes, depending on how you were brought up, depending on the type of family that you have, things can be very hard. And again, it brings up, you know, a bunch of emotional like dysregulation, bringing all those things up if you've also never dealt with it. So not only that, but then putting yourself in that scenario, I feel like the perfect scenario where like a sober person in a room with like family during the holidays would be like, you feel like you are alone when you're by yourself, but then you also feel alone when you're in a group of a bunch of people. It's like maybe you're not in the right room. So find your support group and know that there are other people going through the same thing that you are kind of going through. But if you aren't able to find a support group, or you feel like you're not open or comfortable with finding a support group, tell us how like counseling can play a role in it. And now I know with our level of counseling, you do have to be sober. You can't actively be using, but what role can therapy play during this like high stress time where the holidays can be really hard?
I certainly think like therapy is like a safe space outside of life, right? Like you're in here, it's your space dedicated to you. It's always helpful to have someone to bounce your ideas off of. Like, this is gonna sound really silly, but I say this to my clients: your thoughts are like a bowl of spaghetti, like cooked spaghetti. You know how like they all get tangled up and things like that? Right. Like being able to like say it out loud or talk to someone, bounce those ideas off, kind of like organizes that spaghetti for you so that you can kind of see it from a different perspective or see it from a more logical perspective. When we're extremely emotionally heightened, our logical side of our brain shuts down. So being able to come into a room where they can offer like calming techniques or breathing strategies, things like that, like will help you kind of bring down that emotion so you can actually see the situation more objectively.
And I think that's a huge role. As someone who definitely suffers with anxiety, you can spiral very quickly with some of your thoughts where it's like, hold on, that that's not happening. This is what's actually happening. And it's talking yourself through that. And I think if you don't have a support system, you don't have a therapist that's calling you out on that, how are you going to know? And also, if you've been raised like that your whole entire life, if you're like, you know, in your early 20s and all of that, and that's all you've known, how are you going to know differently?
Right. You would need someone on the outside, an unbiased perspective that's there for you, that like they talk about like unconditional positive regard. Like they're there for you in that moment. They empathize. They can kind of help you work towards your goal and also help you create like a solution-focused plan to tackle these events or tackle a holiday party.
I think that's something too. If people get very nervous, they're like, "Oh my gosh, what's going to happen with this? And what if this happens? And what if this happens? And what if?" Okay, well, you're worried about those things happening. First of all, let's look at how realistic are those things to happen. Number one, and number two. Okay, for the ones that are realistic, like you said, come up with a game plan. And I think that's absolutely great. Like, whether or not you need to take your own car, I think that's phenomenal. I mean, I do what I can in terms of me driving, but I think for like sobriety, I think that's huge. Like no one's forcing you to be there. No one's forcing you to be in an environment where you shouldn't be in. No one's forcing you to be like, oh, well, these are all your triggers. Let's put you in a room with them and see how you do. Like, no one's saying that. So again, you're in control of yourself and control what you can control and learning that. And if you don't know that, that's why we offer therapy. That's why therapy is such a great resource, is because a lot of times people feel like they don't have control over certain things, and you realize in therapy that you are in control, and you may not be in control of everything, but what you can control is how you react to certain things. So like you said earlier, Aunt Mary wants to make a comment, this and that. Aunt Mary, it's great to see you too. Excuse me, I have to go to the restroom. And excuse yourself.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. During this time, are there specific coping mechanisms that people can kind of implement for themselves if they need immediate support? And what are those like self-soothing mechanisms that they can kind of provide for themselves?
Well, I'll point out where you say like immediate, right? Because there's like different types of coping strategies that are probably going to be either quicker in nature or slower in nature. For example, maybe sitting there and doing a grounding technique where you're using your five senses in the room might not be as immediate. You might have to really put in a lot of effort to kind of bring yourself down. But it also depends on your level of distress. So there's also that. But in regards to like more immediate things that I really like are distress tolerance techniques. If you look at DBT, you can kind of like look those things up. But anyway, so my favorite go-to it's called TIP. A lot of acronyms in DBT. So TIP is like, T stands for tip the temperature. So what you want to do is you want to kind of create like an intense, like different temperature on yourself. So like ice, like when you're holding ice in your hand, like where do your thoughts go to? Probably how cold the ice is, right? That hot or cold shower, that's very like intense in like nature, doing those types of things. And then I is intense exercise. So I know like when we're in distress, I don't know if people really want to go do some intense exercise, but it really releases like those feel good hormones, like it releases like endorphins. So you're going to start to feel good from doing it. And I know that's not our go-to. P is pace breathing. So when we talk about like deep breathing, like really pacing those breaths, everyone has different breathing strategies. I like breathing in for 6 seconds, out 7, and I'll count it in my head. It's the easiest thing for me to remember. Some people like drawing a box, breathing in, out, so on and so forth. So kind of finding the one that works best for you. Those are like the quicker things. There's also like different sensations that you can create on your skin. So again, the ice is one of those sensations, but you could like eat sour candy, you could eat something spicy, because when you're eating those things, where do your thoughts go to? How intense like this sensation is. They even say like, and I don't encourage this one completely, because if we take it too far, it's probably not helpful, but like they say like slap a rubber band or hair tie like on your arm, it creates like a sensation.
That I've kind of heard in terms of if I'm overthinking a lot, it's like, okay, like, whoa, like you're having that thought again type of thing, like let's snap your back, like you're dozing off, let's snap you back to reality, but you can definitely see how that can, fine line.
Yeah, I mean, some people might take it a little too far, so maybe not the best, but it does create like that sensation on the skin is what we're looking for. So those are fairly quick. Cold water on your face, things like that are a lot quicker than maybe doing like an imagery exercise in your brain where you're picturing like a calming scene and you're going through all the details, like that might take longer. But still effective nonetheless. It just depends on your level of distress.
I think that's huge, depending on if you're like actively in that distress, if what made you distressed is still in the room with you. There's so many different things that can play a role into that. And so if you feel like you've kind of done all those immediate coping mechanisms for yourself to try to regulate yourself, if you feel like, okay, well, I still need something else. Like, I really don't want to do this in terms of using this or drinking this. I've tried my coping mechanisms. Where else can I kind of go? And that would, I think, turn into kind of hotlines. And I'm sure there's a bunch of different hotlines, but from your experience, what would be kind of like the go-to hotline if this is something you're kind of experiencing?
Well, I guess if you've been to like a treatment facility, say you like had just left or something, like they usually have hotline numbers. Again, the one I mentioned earlier, the SAMHSA one. You could do that. I'm sure if you even like, this doesn't sound very clinical or professional, but if you Googled hotline numbers for whatever, like usually like the first thing that pops up is like a 1-800 number or something like that. But, you know, in addition to kind of what you said in regards to like if the level of distress is still there, the thing with like cravings and urges is they are time limited. So if you can ride out that urge or craving for, I mean, the time differs depending on like where you look, but like, let's say max 30 minutes. And I know 30 minutes sounds like a long time when you're in distress, but if you're using all these skills in that 30 minutes, it might make that time pass. Cravings and urges do end. They don't last forever. If you give in, of course, like, you know, it's going to restart it. But if you wait it out, it will end.
And I'm a little curious, if you do wait it out, the next time you have that craving, do you feel it as harsh as you did the time before that?
I would say the more we're able to ride out or go through these intense feelings, the more we're able to build on our level of distress tolerance. So if I can ride out 30 minutes, maybe the next time won't feel as intense. Like, the idea is like we're building up our ability to tolerate stress more. But again, if you get another craving like shortly after, then we're going to implement that toolbox we talked about. We add more tools to it so that we can just keep trying things. But also, like, coping strategies need to be practiced. Like, you don't just pick up a journal and just, like, start writing, right? Like, these are things that you practice over time so that the efficacy is a lot more there. So, you know, the goal is to practice them, hoping that our level of distress will kind of decrease over time.
I think the first thing that kind of came to mind is, like, when you are forming a habit, what makes a habit a habit? It's a habit because you do that every single day. So you have a habit of waking up every day and brushing your teeth, right? If you, for some reason, like, didn't do that, so like for me, I don't go to the gym, but I used to be an athlete. I'm not going to automatically have a habit of waking up and going to the gym at 5 a.m. every single day, 7 days a week, or that's not realistic. And finding, again, you know, going back, like finding what works for you, and also knowing if what you are doing for yourself is not enough. And kind of recognizing that no one knows you better than you know you. So you need to be aware, and I think, again, be honest with yourself. You feel like it's starting to affect your day-to-day a little too much, so you recognize, you're able to write out that first habit of, okay, that was good. If like 5 minutes later you have a you know, another craving, it's like, okay, well, what at this point, is there something that's triggering this? Or triggering me to want to do this? And if there is, then that's something you explore, you know, individually with educating yourself, with a counselor. And that's why it's important to having an outside point of view where, you know, you may be beating yourself up about doing something, or maybe certain family members are pressuring you about certain things, but you need to be open so that you can then be like, well, no, this is why I feel the way that I do. This is why I'm doing what I'm doing. And you have to want to change that. No one can want that for you.
Right.
So for the listeners who are struggling during this time, whatever they're kind of going through, and from your point of view as a therapist, what piece of advice would you give individuals who are trying to stay sober or manage their sobriety with their family or just, you know, society during the holidays?
Yeah, and I know I didn't mention this earlier, so it's gonna be like new information, but those of you that have been through like recovery or through like treatment centers, like you might have heard this. So there are 3 stages of relapse. Like a lot of times we think that it's just like right to like the physical relapse, but really it starts with like the emotional relapse. So that is like where those stressors come into play, where we start to feel like depressed or anxious or tired or burnt out, like all those feelings. If we can address those there, we don't have to go to that next stage or like the final stage. So, you know, I do encourage like utilizing those coping strategies, setting boundaries, self-care. Like that's so important that you're taking care of you. And I think a big thing is like when you're in recovery, like you kind of want to push yourself to do things. And there's nothing wrong with pushing yourself, but you don't have to challenge yourself. Being in recovery is hard enough. Holidays are hard. So like if you don't feel, like if you reflect back and you're like, I don't feel ready to be here, or I just like don't feel right today, you don't have to do it. Like you don't have to challenge yourself.
Yeah. In terms of like challenging yourself could be like, well, I'm going to be sober and be around all of like this alcohol, you know, during this time, or around, you know, this substance around this time, where if you've only been sober for a week, be realistic with yourself. Why would you test yourself like that? You're not going to keep doing those things. So be honest with yourself. And I think the other thing is really important for the listeners as well is what you mentioned earlier is prioritizing self-care. So like what you're kind of craving during this time is like you want to feel good inside, whether it's from a substance, whether it's from, you know, that drink, whatever it is, you're trying to feel good. And there's other ways or other things that you can do in order to feel good. So self-care is a great way for that. So for me, what I do to feel good is I get my nails done. You know, there's a lot of different things, but for the listeners, what are some other things that they can kind of do during this time to kind of prioritize self-care for them?
Well, I think first, like the biggest thing, don't put yourself on the back burner. A lot of times, like we put ourselves on the back burner, making sure like everyone else is okay. What do you want? What do you need? A lot of time when we want to set a boundary, we get like a very physical response to it. Like I don't know about everyone, but like maybe my heart starts racing or my palms get sweaty or whatever, right? Like I get a very physical reaction to it. That's your body's way of telling you like you need to do something. You need to say no. You need to walk away, whatever. In regards to like self-care practices, like that looks different for everyone, but it is important that you are putting yourself first, especially like during this time, because people are going to pull you in all different directions. Like come to this party, come shopping with me, and like see what your capacity is. Don't just do it because they're asking.
Yeah, it's like, okay, well, I need to do this and do this and do this. And it's like, okay, did you take a moment for yourself this week? And especially, that's also, like, that is just only including, like, holiday stuff in terms of friends and family. That is not even also adding on there if you have, like, a job that, like, requires you to work over 40 hours a week on top of all of this. So then it's like, okay, navigating work, finding time to meet with all these people, getting gifts for all these people, wrapping these gifts. It can definitely add up where it's like, slow down. You don't need to say yes to everything. Yes, it may stink you didn't get to go to that party, but think about it. If there's going to be drinking there, if there's going to be things that you don't really want to surround yourself with, again, evaluate it. Is it really important? And I know some people suffer from FOMO. I do too. But then again, it's like your support group. If that's your support group, then maybe you wouldn't have FOMO if your support group was all sober or all did the same thing that, you know, you're doing. So I know we're just getting to the end of our episode. And I know we usually end our episode with a couple different things, but just to kind of sum up, recognizing if you need help and if you need extra support, which is there's nothing wrong with that. Recognizing your triggers and adjusting accordingly with that. And then also reminding yourself and kind of recognizing if you haven't already, you are in control of you. So you may not be able to control what your family says or what this person says or what this person does. All you can kind of do is work on what you want to kind of work on for yourself and your sobriety and take it day by day. Was there kind of anything else that you let the listeners know about or kind of just end off on in terms of your knowledge on addiction during this time?
I think you pretty much summed up what I was thinking. But I think just something that comes to mind is like, remember why you're in recovery. Like there's a reason why you chose to not drink, not to use. Like there's an amplitude of reasons why you chose that, because recovery is hard. So like remember those reasons because it's so easy to forget like pain and like what it was like when you're like so far removed from it.
There's a lot more pros and cons while doing it. And sometimes if you're, like you said, in distress and feeling, upset about whatever the case may be, you may have those thoughts of, well, what if I just did this again? And that's okay. You're allowed to have those thoughts, but recognizing it and not acting on it, I think is the key. And something to kind of find balance on. In regards to the last question that we ask all of our clinicians that come on the episode is, if you were stuck on an island, you could bring one book with you. What book would you bring with you and why?
I'll be honest. I am a little traumatized from school and having to read so much and then all like the continuing education reading. So I'm going to go with Survival Guide because I wouldn't know what to do. I would probably just lay there and cry.
I agree with you on that one. And definitely in terms of like school and stuff too, and just like reading things because you have to and because your professor's telling you or because you have an assignment. It's very different in terms of reading things because you enjoy it or you want to educate yourself. So even with like what we talked about today, if you don't want to go to an AA or NA, that's totally fine. There are so many books out there, and like, know that you're, as corny as that sounds, as we always say, you're not alone. We always need someone to talk to, whether that's, a parent, whether that's an outside perspective, like a family member or a friend, and even taking it one step further out. Even if it's a clinician where it's like completely third party, they have no connections to your life, and getting that feedback because there's always room to grow. I always say that. I'm sorry, we're not perfect. That's not how the world is.
And again, if you need a book recommendation, you can ask your therapist because I'm sure they have a plethora of books that they can offer to you.
Absolutely, especially in regards to this. There's a lot of different books that are very interesting on mental health in terms of like the science behind it, what you can work on, fiction books in regards to like what that's kind of like. So a lot of things to kind of explore, but thank you for coming on, talking about addiction during this time. And we will see you guys all on the next episode when we talk about grief during the holiday and what that's like.